Hey, Steve Stine from GuitarZoom here, and what I want to do is help you in trying to dial in a guitar tone. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few different things here in terms of playing at home versus playing on stage, effects, and setting things up as best I can. Now, please understand that whenever somebody talks about guitar tone, there's a lot of subjectivity here because everybody's different in what they're looking for. But what I want to do is help you in sort of dispelling some of the myths that we have with guitar tone and trying to make things just easier for you all the way around. So the first thing to do is to talk about your hands and your fingers and all that sort of thing. People are often saying that guitar tone, it starts with your fingers and the way you pick and all those sorts of things. And that is absolutely true. So if we thought about someone like Joe Satriani, right? Joe Satriani walks into it sounds like a joke, but it's not. Joe Satriani walks into a music store and he plugs into a $50 amp with a $30 guitar. And he makes it sound good, which is very, very, very probable that would happen. But what you have to ask yourself, is that ideally what Joe Satriani wants, or is he just trying to kind of prove a point that you can still make good music on lesser expensive gear or lesser quality gear? And the answer is absolutely you can, okay? My discussion with you is not about going out and spending a bunch of money, but finding the right stuff and dialing it in the right way for you, okay? So even if Joe Satriani does this, you know darn well that he's going to be far more comfortable and confident on his own gear, his own guitar, his own amp, all those sorts of things. And you and I are no different, okay? I always think of, like, when I explain this to students, I always explain that guitar gear is kind of like your bed, right? You can, just like the Joe Satriani analogy, you can sleep on the floor. You can sleep on a hardwood floor. You could sleep outside in the desert, right? It doesn't mean you're going to get a good night's sleep. It doesn't mean that you're looking forward to it. It doesn't mean that it's comfortable. It's just what is necessary to get the job done versus sleeping on the ideal bed. My wife likes a bed that's very, 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 very hard, and I like a bed that's very, 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 very soft. So the whole point is that we're all different. So the things I'm going to tell you about are merely suggestions to start with that are more optimal in a recording or a live situation versus just kind of doing what a record sounds like. So again, these are all options, but just understand that, for you to find the right guitar and for you to find the right amp and then be able to dial those things in is going to be incredibly important. And I'm going to have to talk to you without playing for a few minutes here just to kind of get this set up, so I don't want to bore you, but you'll notice that I oftentimes play these Ibanez gems. I have a whole host of different Ibanez gems that I own. And I don't know that they're the greatest guitar out there for me, but I know that they're the ones that I gravitated toward because they felt the best for my height and the size of my hands and all that sort of thing. So it's not that I don't like Les Pauls, and it's not that I don't like, other styles of guitars and things like that. They're all wonderful guitars. I'm not standing on a platform that says Ibanez is the greatest guitar in the world. Ibanez gems are, at this point in my life, the best guitar for me as a player. And that doesn't mean that you want to run out and buy an Ibanez gem or something like that. And this is what I grew up with, because when I was a kid learning how to play, we had guitar magazines. There was no internet, of course, and things like that. So all you really knew of players is pictures that you would see of, them playing on stage, or you might see some clip on TV and stuff like that. This was before MTV even. And so you get this thought in your mind that in order to play and sound like Slash, or in order to play and sound like whoever, you got to own everything that they own, and then you got to dial it in. And that brings me to my next thing, which if you've never heard me tell this story, and I don't know if the story's true or not, but I always used to hear this story of Van Halen and Ted Nugent being on tour together. And one night before a show or after a show or something, like it must have been before a show, but Ted Nugent went out and plugged into Eddie Van Halen's gear, not knowing that Eddie Van Halen was actually in the stadium or wherever it was they were at the time. And Eddie was watching Ted play, and Eddie said Ted sounded like Ted. He didn't sound like Eddie, obviously, just because he plugged into Eddie's gear. He sounded like Ted Nugent playing. So it's really important to understand that all of this stuff that we're talking about is subjective, and it's important for you to find your home when it comes to tone. And I'm going to tell you one more story. Many, many years ago, I bought it was called a Line 6, that's the company, and the head was called a Vetta, V-E-T-T-A. And it was kind of state-of-the-art at the time because you were able to dial in 2 different amp tones, 2 different cabinets, blah, 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 all this stuff, which at that time was really not heard of. So it was all digital. And I was so excited to get this head because I'm like, man, now I can run a Marshall and I can make it stereo. I can run a Marshall on my left side and a Mesa on the right side. And I can, at the time, our band, all of our PA was stereo as well, true stereo. So I could run a Marshall tone out of there and I could run a Mesa tone out of this side. And I was, spent hours in my room or out my garage. I would always practice or dial in my tones in the garage because I could turn up to the volume that I wanted to be at on stage, and then I would dial in my sound. So we're going to get to that in a little bit. But so I dialed in like 6 different patches of all these different things, right? All these different cabinets, different whatever. And so I'm super excited. We go on the road with the band that I'm in, and we're setting all of our gear up, and I'm like, guys, you've got to hear this. So I'm like, tell me which one you think is the best. So I play, patch number 1 that I created and spent all this time with. Go to patch number 2 and play that, go to patch number 3 and so on. And I get done and the guys in the band go, they all sound the same. And it's not that I didn't know it before, but that really reinforced the fact that when I sit down to play, first of all, I'm using this guitar or one of these guitars that I always use. So there's already a catalyst going into the tone that I'm creating, which is the guitar that I'm using, right? You've probably seen, I've got like a road-worn Strat that I like to use. Now, the sounds that I create are going to have a different effect with that, or different interactivity, if you will, with that guitar than it does with this guitar. But when I'm on stage, 99% of the time I'm using one of these Ibanez Gems, and they all have EMG pickups in them. They're all very similar to each other that way. They all feel a little different to me. They all sound a little different to me. The wood is a little different and all. And I'm not going to get into all of that stuff because that's a whole nother ballgame. But my point is, this guitar feels like home to me. This is my comfortable bed, right? And so my guitar is number 1 in my chain of tone. The amp can change. I might use a Marshall, I might use a Mesa, I might use an Orange, I might use whatever. But everything that I do from the pyramid down starts with my guitar. And of course, me, right? This is my buddy, right? So when I made all these tones and they all sounded the same to the guys, there might have been certain nuances that I was hearing, but overall, what I was hearing in my head, I was basically just replicating with different gear. So if I was using a different kind of cabinet, emulation, I would readjust the EQ, not knowing that I'm really just redialing in the same thing over and over and over. So what I have found since then is it doesn't really matter what amp I use. I wind up dialing in something that is somewhat similar to what I'm hearing in my head. Now, it doesn't mean that a clean tone is going to sound like a distorted tone or a high gain tone. No, they're all going to be different that way, but my high gain tones are all going to be similar, or my crunchy tones are all going to be similar, or my clean gains, or my clean tones are going to be similar. Because when I sit down, if I was at your house and I grabbed your amp and your guitar and I started dialing it in, I would get something like that if it was possible. If it's absolutely impossible to get that kind of tone, I would go with the best I got to make the situation work, but that wouldn't be an amp that I would choose. Okay? And I've played many, many amps, and I've found that you really can dial in a decent tone on just about anything. So that's what I want to help you with, okay? So for me, the pyramid starts with my guitar. All of my guitars, for the most part, have these EMG pickups. I've got an 80, this one's an 81, this is an 89, and this is an SA, okay? The 89 is actually an 85, but you've got a push-pull pot that makes it into an SA. And that's basically what I use for most of my guitars. When I play on stage in a band, I am not one of those players that tries to dial in a tone that sounds like Pink Floyd and then tries to dial in a tone that sounds like Ted Nugent and then tries to dial in a tone that sounds like Stevie Ray Vaughan. I have never been that kind of player, and there's nothing wrong with it. I've just never been that kind of player. I have my sounds, and that's what I use. So I've got cleans and dirties and whatever that I've dialed in, but I don't try and emulate other people's tones. I try and play what I'm hearing in my head, and then I adjust from there, which is what I'm going to show you in this lesson. So if that kind of makes sense, I need you to think about, without making yourself crazy, think about your guitar, right? And think, is this guitar really me? Does it really fit my hands? Does it fit? Does the fretboard feel good? Am I able to do all the things that I need to do as a player, right? Are the strings the right thickness, right? Was I talked into going to a way thinner set or a way thicker set because it's supposed to help or hurt something? Is it really suiting my needs? If I'm more of a rhythm player, I could use a thicker set of strings and it's probably going to be just fine. But if I do a lot of bending and stuff like that, maybe a thicker set is going to be detrimental to my playing. It might make me sound good. It might, make the tone sound thicker. But if it's getting in the way of what I want to do as a guitar player, it's not beneficial to me, right? So if I get somebody's guitar and it's got super fat strings on there and they play it awesome, I'm going to have a hard time with it. I just am, because I've got thinner, my fingers aren't as strong. Certainly as I get older, it's even worse. But even so, I like the feel of thinner strings to be able to do the things that I want to do, okay? So I've found a home with this Ibanez gem and these EMGs and the strings that I use. And again, primarily I use GHS boomers for my strings. Doesn't mean they're better. Doesn't mean you should use them, okay? They're just what makes sense to me. So even though I know, Steve Vai might use whatever, or Joe Satriani might use whatever, or Nuno Betancourt might use whatever, it doesn't make any difference. This is where I am. So yes, this is a Steve Vai style guitar, and if you've heard me play before, which you probably have, I really don't play much like Steve Vai at all. But thank goodness I found a guitar that really does feel right to me. Now, there might still be something out there that I've never played that I'd play it and go, holy crap, this is the greatest guitar ever. But my days of buying lots of gear and lots of guitars and, my whole... Because everybody kind of goes through that where you love to buy gear, right? And I'm kind of over that. I've found my home. I found that bed that feels most comfortable, and that's kind of where I stay. And I'm hoping the same thing someday happens to you. I've got guitar friends that they're never, ever, ever, ever happy with their stuff. They're never happy with their guitars. They're never happy with their amps. They're never happy with their effects. So they're just always on this search. And it can drive you crazy after a while. Even, the kind of cables you're using and, the batteries you're using. I mean, it could just get ridiculous. So I'm going to stop talking a little bit. We're going to get into the thick of this thing. I wanted you to know that, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is just talk about, once you've established your guitar and all that sort of thing, and we're at the amp now, okay? Taking away all effects at all, and just dealing with the core element of the guitar, or the amp, excuse me. The easiest way to start dialing in an amplifier is to kind of put everything at straight up, right? So instead of going all the way down or all the way up on something, just start with all the dials straight up towards the ceiling. Okay, minus the volume, of course. You might have to edit a little bit. Because if you have to vastly change everything all the time, you have to start wondering if whether or not that amp is really for you. Okay, it's just a suggestion. But what happens a lot is that people, when they don't play out in clubs and things like that, they dial in what we call a bedroom tone, which is when you have an amp in your room and you can't play very loud, so you dial it in and you're listening to some song and you dial in your tone. The tone that winds up on that CD or that, MP3 or whatever it is that you're listening to sounds vastly different than it did when it was in the studio most of the time, okay? So here's a couple things to avoid when it comes to just tone. We're talking about, bass, treble, and mids, that sort of thing. Oftentimes you get people that will turn their bass all the way up, turn their mids way down, and then their treble goes wherever. And then you create this bedroom tone as a result of that. And the problem is if you were to take that amp then set like that and you were going to go out and perform with it and you get it out on stage and you turn it up or you stick a microphone in front of it and it goes through the PA, you're going to wind up with a tone that really just sounds like this. Okay? It just sounds muddy and it gets lost in the mix. Because when you're performing, Now, again, recording is a little bit different, and we'll get to that. A little bit different. But when you're performing, the mid-range becomes one of the most important frequencies that you have, because the mid-range is what cuts through the mix of the bass and the drums and everything else that's happening. The downside to it is, as you turn those mids up, you become more exposed as a player because your guitar tone starts cutting through. When people set their bass and treble all the way up and turn their mids all the way up, they can do this and they can play all they want, and you're never going to hear anything. It's just, you can see their fingers moving. So it's a nice way of masking and playing with a band and not really being heard, but it's not helping the band, okay? It's certainly not helping the overall mix of your band. And so those mids become incredibly important to be able to turn them up. I remember in college, when I first went to college, I'd played in some different bands in high school, but nothing big. And when I got to college, I remember I went to Moorhead State University in Moorhead, Minnesota, and I remember we were getting ready for a guitar recital. So I brought out my head and my 412. And I don't remember what I had at the time. I don't. Maybe it was a Randall. It might have been a Randall solid state or something like that. I don't remember. Anyway. It was total bedroom tone, right? So I turn this thing up, and I'm on this stage. We're prepping, right? So I have all these other guitar players on stage with me, all these great guitar players, and I'm a newbie to all of this kind of stuff, right? This whole live thing is new to me. I think I was 18 at the time, because I graduated when I was 17, so I think I was 18 at the time. And I remember my guitar instructor through the microphone, through the PA going, "What is that tone, Steve?" And I was like, oh crap, So that's when I started learning that it doesn't work that way, okay? You can't just turn the bass all the way up and then play, because through the PA you just get this whoop, 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 flubby thing. And don't get me wrong, treble and bass have their place to a certain degree. Like if you were playing through a Marshall doesn't have a lot of bass to begin with. But if you're playing through like a Mesa Boogie, there's a lot of bass in there. So it just depends on the amp and how the amp responds. And again, that's why you got to use your ear, not just this visual dialing of, well, this is where I always set my amps, so this is how I'm going to do it, or I always turn them all the way up, or I always turn this all the way off. Don't do that. You got to listen, okay? And here's the second part of that. I'll kind of interject. The best thing that you can do is create tones at the volume in which you normally play. So if you play in your bedroom and your tone sounds awesome right there, perfect. You are good to go. But understand that if you take that amp now and you play it in a band situation or a live situation and you turn the volume up, it's not going to sound like that at a louder volume. The shape of your tone is going to change as you raise that volume up. It's going to become something else. Okay, there's a bunch of different reasons why, but you could look up, I'm not going to go into detail, but you can go look up the term Fletcher-Munson curve. And basically the Fletcher-Munson curve, what they learned was frequency changes vastly or greatly as the tone or as the volume increases. Okay, so that goes back to my story about the Line 6 that I got. When I go out in my garage and I'm dialing in my tones, I'm dialing them in at a volume that I know that I'm going to be playing at most of the time, okay? And again, most of us don't play in stadiums where you're playing in front of 10,000 people all the time. So you're not playing at ungodly loud volumes. You're playing at a moderate volume. It's louder than bedroom tone, but it's not, if you took a 100-watt amp and turned it all the way up, that's frickin' loud. I mean, if you're louder than the PA that you're playing through, your PA or your sound guy's going to hate you. And plus, you're not really part of the mix anymore. You're just louder than everybody else. And part of the goal is finding that right volume for your amp to be at where you're blending with the rest of the people in your band. When I play in church, I play at a far lower volume than I do when I'm playing with one of my metal bands or original bands or whatever it might be. So my tones are dialed in for those bands. When I play in church, I just lower the volume down. Now, is it a perfect church tone? No, it's not, but it's suffice. I mean, it's not going to be horrible. It's just I know where my sweet spot is on my guitar amp. I know the volume that it needs to be at to be able to get what I need from that guitar amp. Now, if I wasn't if I wasn't as busy and maybe wanted more time with it, I could dial in tones at 7 different volumes, right, for different situations. But I don't do that. I sit down, I get my stuff dialed in at the volume that I ideally play at on a regular basis, and that's where my stuff is. So if I play it in my bedroom, it's going to sound way less than it should. If I play it in church, I get to go up more than that, but it still doesn't sound as ideal as I want it. But that's the trade-off that I have. So hopefully that kind of makes sense with your amp, just dry sounds, okay? So your volume, needless to say, can be wherever it is. Your gain, your distortion, same thing, okay? The problem with distortion all the way around is people, for the most part, dial in far too much distortion on their tones. Yes, we want distortion, okay? But if you dial in way too much distortion, you wind up getting just this flubby sort of, I don't even know how to describe it, but your tone winds up mushy, okay? And yes, when you listen to albums and whatever, it might sound like that, but when you get out in the real world, there's an element of cleanliness that needs to happen with your fingers and your tone. And when you dial in too much distortion, you lose that. Now, again, it makes for a perfect veil or a perfect mask, so people can't really hear what you're doing. But if you really want to be a part of your band and you really want a decent tone, you got to be careful of that. So here's the deal that I always tell people with distortion. If you're not a big distortion fan, then you don't even have to worry about this, right? But if you are, the goal is to bring your distortion back as far as you could possibly handle and still get a decent, like, palm mute. Like, what I always do is I'll go to... Now you can hear that the distortion that I'm getting right now is a bit more crunchy. This is a plexi tone. Okay, so it's a little more on the AC/DC side of things. Okay, now I'm going to go to this patch, and now you're going to hear the distortion again. Now you're going to hear that the distortion is smoother. It's not as crunchy on the outside. But you can hear each note ring out, right, as I'm palm muting. It's not just this big flub of... There we go. I was just shutting my delay off. Okay? Now, for many of the people that would watch this, what you have to understand is that might not be a tone you're looking for, and that's okay. That's my whole point to this, okay? But I know what I want in tones. So if I want something that's more plexi-like, and if I need a little less... Okay, so that brings us to the second thing, which is once we've got our amp kind of dialed in, we understand this problem with mids and lows and highs and how people overuse or underuse elements of that. We've got this distortion thing. Now I go to my guitar. And this is where the big thing is understanding that the toggle switch and your volume and your tone to, for me, for a lesser degree, if you're someone like, maybe Jeff Beck or something, you use your tone control a lot. I don't use, as a matter of fact, my tone control is disabled, and I'll explain that in a minute here. But your volume and your toggle switch make all the difference in the world in setting up your tones, okay? So if I was on this, and this is, that's full out. That's, I'm on this pickup right here. I'm in my first position with my toggle switch. So I'm full on there. My volume's all the way up. Now, if I take that and I switch, now you can hear a lot of difference between those tones. Now what I like to do is I'll switch to a different pickup position, like maybe the second position. I have 5 because I have 3 pickups, so I have 5 positions here. So I'll go to my second position, and then I'll lower my volume down. And I might even pick softer. And I get a bit different sound. Now watch as So there's a lot of variables in between with this one patch. So instead of making, on whatever amp you've got, if you can do this, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit later too, but if you've got an amp where you can set up different guitar tones, like this amp that I'm using right now, I can have up to 128 of them. Well, when I'm on stage, I don't want to be pressing buttons, switching between 64 different frickin' settings. That's not the way it works for me. I'd rather have a setting that gives me what I need maximum for that particular setting, and then minimize with my guitar. So instead of going, okay, I want to lighten up a little bit from this tone that I've got, I've got to go to another patch to do it. I don't want to go to another patch to do it. If I chose this patch, there's a reason why I'm here. So there's a lot of variable in this one patch, okay? And again, we'll come back to this a little bit later in this conversation, but understand that what I basically try and do is I make 4 patches or 4 channels that on the top side are maximum of what I need on each channel, and then I can minimize with my guitar. So my guitar is doing the other work. And my EMGs have always worked really well for that. Having 3 pickups for me has always been kind of the pinnacle for me, where if I'm a Les Paul guy, I have 2 pickups, and my toggle switch is up here, which is very, very weird for me, where it might be home for you. It might be your perfect bed for you, right? It isn't for me. I love having the toggle switch down here, and I love having 5 positions because I really do use all 5 of those all the time. And then I roll my volume as needed, okay? So anyway, that kind of gives you an idea of your guitar, of the amp, basic amp settings, and then what we're going to do is we're going to move in and start talking about specific effects to a certain degree, and then we're going to come back out and talk about amps and different things like that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about reverb. Now I've got a photo of a Boss RV6 pedal. Okay, just to show you, there's a million reverb pedals out there, okay? But this is the first one, is just reverb. That wetness that comes. Can you shut it off? Now, if I was recording, and again, it depends on the situation, depends on what I'm writing, it depends on what I'm doing, but you'll notice when I take that reverb off, it's really thick and it's in your face, right? Okay, so when you're recording or when you're playing, well, recording is the most ideal thing, but even when I'm playing live, when you're playing live, there's a natural reverberation that happens anyway because you're playing in a facility, whether it's a small place or a big place. But reverb is something that can be used very effectively to just wetten your tone. And certainly if you want to do some sort of soloing and things like that, if I turn it on here, okay, and I've got... Reverb is a really nice thing to use. Now, you'll notice for me, I don't use a really long reverb. I don't use a really wide reverb, okay? I try and have something that decays fairly quickly. So it's not getting in the way of my actual notes. As I play, you can hear all the notes that I'm playing. The reverb is back there making it a bit more floaty, right? But it's not getting in the way. Where sometimes with all of these effects that we're going to talk about, it is very possible to use them too much. And again, then you've got this veil or this mask where you're playing and nobody can really understand anything that you're doing, but they're going, yay! But in reality, you know that whatever you're doing is it's just too much. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't situations where you want more of something or whatever. There are. for sure. Like David Gilmour, for me, has a great guitar tone. He's got a great solo tone. And reverb to me is something that works really well when I'm soloing. When I'm playing rhythm, I don't use as much reverb because I really don't need it. I'd rather have everything be as tight as possible, and that reverb sometimes kind of gets in the way. But when I go to solo, I love having reverb on there. So just something to think about a little bit. So again, reverb for me, it's the tail, if you will. Okay, it doesn't go on forever. I'm not playing in, it isn't 10 seconds long or something like that, and it isn't just huge where it just envelops that tone, right? It just kind of trails off at the end. It's just a tail, if you will. That's how I like my reverb to be. And again, I use reverb primarily when I'm trying to do solos and things like that, but I like it to be out of the way if I'm doing a lot of rhythm stuff, okay? Where if I'm going... now listen to it if I go... See what I mean? It's just there, man. It's in your face. And that to me is what a tone should be. There isn't way too much distortion on here. Okay? And all my dials are pretty much in. My mid, for me, because I've become an advocate of mid-range, my mid-range is always really hot, right? 7, 8, 9, who knows? It depends on the amp, but I turn those mid-range way up because I play live a lot and I want my tone to cut through. Where my bass is usually down around 5 or 6, somewhere around there, meaning here, somewhere around there. And my treble or my presence is just relative to whatever it is I need. I do know, though, as I turn my volume up, my presence becomes more gritty. The high end becomes more gritty. So I have to be careful. When I'm at a bedroom tone, my high end or my treble or whatever you want to call it might be a little higher. But as I turn my volume up, I got to be careful because all of a sudden that's going to get to be too much and people are going to go, holy crap, that sounds thin. You can make your tone sound really thin with too much treble. So back to the reverb thing. So that kind of explains to you how you can use a reverb. Okay, there's no specifics to dialing it in. You just have to kind of figure out how. Even that reverb is bigger than I normally use, and right now I've just got it set like that. Because the last recording I was using that tone. You see, so it's not overwhelming when I do that. There's a lot there, but if I... and most people would go, well, that's a metal guitar, and EMGs are for metal, but yet I can get tones that are not so metal. I remember going in the studio with a friend of mine many, many years ago, and we were recording some Beatles tunes and some Tom Petty tunes and some different things like that. And he was like, we got done recording, and he goes, I can't believe you got all of those tones out of that guitar. I never imagined that guitar would make all those sounds. And he's right. It has to do with adjusting things and the way you're picking, right? You'll notice I'm picking softer and louder at different times and things like that. So that's something to think about a little bit as you're playing, is trying to kind of dial those things in. Where there's more grit on the top side there, and it's supposed to be. But if I back everything off, okay, it mellows everything out. All right, so moving on, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about delay. Okay, delay is the next big thing that I like to use, certainly when I'm soloing. Okay, again, when I'm playing rhythm, it depends on the situation. But for the most part, when I'm trying to create a soloing tone, if I turn on my delay, there it is. Now, because I'm on a channel right now where I tend to play a lot of kind of rhythm stuff, there's a little more reverb than I normally would use, because it's trying to create kind of this back sort of washy sound. You see, so it sounds kind of nice that way. Whatever, right? Okay, let me go to a little bit heavier tone. This is back to my plexi now. Now my rhythm or my reverb is on, but notice how little there is. That's what I would normally use for a reverb. This is barely on. There's just a little bit in the background, so it's out of the way, where that other channel was more of a clean channel that I would use for more picking style things or stuff like that, where I wouldn't be full on. Where this, but there isn't much going on there for a reverb, and that's the way I like it. Okay, I'm gonna add delay in now. Here's the delay. That's an ideal delay for me, as I set it somewhere around 660 milliseconds. Okay, and there'll usually be 2, maybe 3 delays that you can hear. But that's it. Now it's still a little bit much. But it makes for a really pretty sounding solo. So if I wasn't trying to go super fast and all that kind of thing, this would make for a nice sounding. Because my distortion at this point is more of a rock and roll distortion, it's not full out. Works really well for me, okay? If it was too much, if I wanted to do something a little more aggressive, I'd probably turn my delay off. Then it's more in your face again, okay? Let me go to this next channel. This is more of a JCM style distortion, which is kind of where I live in terms of a lot of the stuff that I play. This is kind of my ideal tone right here. You hear that delay in the background? Again, 2, maybe 3, but mostly you'll hear 2, and then it's gone. And you'll notice that this delay is a little quieter than the other delay, again, because for the most part when I'm soloing here, I'm doing my usual thing. So it's just there to fill space behind. You see? To fill space underneath there. It sounds great when you're doing like those kind of bends or something where you've got time in between. Sounds pretty nice. Again, if it's too much, I can shut it off, and now it's gone. And it's out of the way. I could take it completely off with the reverb, and now I've got a straightforward kind of tone with this thing. So, again, the point is that on these primary 4 tones that I create, which I'll get to in a minute here, I've created delays that are a little bit more reflective of the tone that I would choose for that particular song or style of music or situation that I'm playing in. As it gets heavier, there isn't as much of all of those things because I want it to cut through more. Okay? Now again, if you want more delay or if you like more reverb, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're always using big, huge delays and big, huge reverbs, everything gets washed out. So when you're trying to play rhythm, people don't hear as much of what's going on. Or when you go to solo, unless you're playing really, melodic, slow kind of solos, everything gets washed out because as you're playing, everything starts kind of falling over each other. Now again, This is my opinion to you of how to do some of this stuff. You've got to readjust however it is necessary. But I will tell you that the most important thing with everything that we're talking about is try to avoid the veil, right? Try to avoid the mask. Don't use any of these things, tone setting, guitar, effects, whatever, to hide something, okay? Become the player that you should be, and then use these things to speak to your audience. You know, don't use these things to try and hide inadequacies or don't do that, okay? Because it just winds up bringing you down, and it winds up bringing your band down, okay? There's nothing, when I go out to see bands play, whether they're local bands or whether they're touring bands or, you know, famous bands or whatever it is, I love a tone that you go, wow, there's that guitar player. I can hear him. I can hear him doing his thing. Versus what is going on there? You know, you see a guitar player and he'll be doing all this stuff, and you can't hear anything. It's just a mush. Everything's just... Man, you're working really hard for nothing, because you could just as well just be doing this, because it doesn't make any difference, because all the work that you're putting in isn't coming through the mix anyway. It's not helping your band, okay? So it's really important to think about those things. Now we're going to get into a few, I shouldn't say lesser, but things that will make a difference in a different way. The first one we're going to look at is, I'm going to go back here. We're going to look at, I'm going to take this off. Now I'm going to add chorus, okay? Chorus. Chorus is not an effect that I use on a regular basis unless it's particular to a song, and I very much like my chorus to be something that I use when I'm cleaner than when I'm using something that has more gain. Okay, but there's a photo that you'll see here of an MXR analog style chorus. Now let me add a little reverb into that. Sounds kind of nice. Little delay in there. Maybe get a little more meat in my tone, so I went up to my fourth position. I'm going to pick it a little softer so I don't get so much of that. I'm going to back off. Okay, and again, this comes back to my point that I originally made in the beginning when I was talking about Joe Satriani. If I take all that off, okay, I can still make music, but it's lacking that sort of real-world stadium thing where... This is why I find, you know, effects to a certain degree something of a necessity, because it makes you feel good, because it fills that space when you're not playing. I mean, there's just an element of, I don't know if I should call it professionalism, but something in there that makes it sound really, really awesome. When you're picking through this stuff, you see? Where if I was playing... I don't know that I need all of that on there to do some strumming. I could take, you know, my delay and reverb. Because it's really pointless in the background there. It's just creating mush. So I'll take that off. So... Please understand that if you're used to always just leaving everything on and turning your volume all the way up and turning your toggle switch to one position and you're done, you're missing out on a lot of really good stuff that you could be doing by thinking a little bit more logically about this, okay? So rhythm, when I'm strumming and doing things like that, I have less of those effects, where chorus works really nice in this situation. Delay and reverb tend to kind of muddy things up. When I'm picking through stuff, I really like delay and reverb on there. Chorus is a nice added effect if I need. But like when I get heavier in my tones, and you can certainly take notes on all this stuff, but as I get heavier in my tones, I'm going to use less of all of those things. Okay, unless I really need a solo that's really slow and whatever, and I want a big delay or a big reverb or something with that. But as I get heavier, my chorus, I really don't use chorus at all. It just winds up sounding kind of awkward. And I'm not saying that there isn't certain songs that use choruses. Again, that goes back to that same thing where when I'm live, I'm not trying to replicate a tone. I'm trying to give my audience the best sound that I can, so they can hear everything that I'm doing, and I'm trying to give my band the best sound that I can so they can line up with the things that I'm doing. They can hear everything, the drummer can hear everything, and we're playing together. There's a nice lock happening there, where if I just give them this big wet sound, it's hard for my drummer to know where the heck I am, because they're just mush everything. Okay? So now we'll move on a little bit. We'll start talking about some other things that you can do. Now, let me go back to... maybe this one. Yeah, maybe this one. Well, either one of them. I don't use a lot of this, but what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the pedals that give you a little bit of boost, okay? A really famous one that you'll see a photo of here is the Ibanez Tube Screamer. One that I use a lot of, which I don't have in my patch right now, is made by a company called Taurus, and it's called the Infinity pedal, which I really, really love. But basically what they do is they just kind of give you a little bit more push with your tone. Actually, I could kind of show you that here, I think. Like if I do this. Here's a bit of a rock tone again. I'll take the delay off this. Okay, so here's my tone. Which is pretty straightforward rock and roll. Now, watch. So it's just another push up. When I need that, I need it to push, I need it to tighten up. Maybe a little more distortion, I could certainly do. That's where that pedal is going to come in, and it's going to serve me very well. I like having that pedal, and again, I use Tube Screamers for years, but I've just found that Taurus pedal, which again, we've got photos of both of those, but the Taurus pedal works really well for me for boosting to that next level. So that'll be a pedal that I will have that isn't on until I need it, until I need that push over the edge. So this is a situation where that patch that I've made, that I was telling you about, I need something more. I need more than what I can get out of my guitar and the settings that I've got. That's where that pedal will come in and kind of push me over the edge. That's what I like about that. And that will bring me to this conversation here, which is the, I told you about my tone, my guitar tone. I don't have a tone in my guitar. This thing is removed. So what I do is I have a chip in my guitar that my tech guys put in there. Which does something similar to that. When I need more, now you're not going to notice it. If I go to my clean sound, you'll notice it more. So what it does is it pushes a little bit of a boost, similar to what maybe a Tube Screamer or something like that could do. Not to the same extent, but it's another little hidden thing that I like to have in my guitar, because if I'm playing through your gear, I don't have the stuff that I normally have. So it's nice to be able to push over the top when I need it. So if I'm ever in a situation where I'm playing on somebody else's gear, I've been asked up to play, I'm in the studio somewhere, and I need a little bit more of something, I need a little bit more gain, or I need a little bit more of that push, I've got it built right into my guitar. Okay, it doesn't do the exact same thing, but it's something similar. So when I need something a little bit more, okay, that's what I've got that for. So that's another really neat thing. The next thing to talk about, which I don't even have hooked up right now, but is a wah pedal. Now I use a Steve Vai Morley wah pedal. It's called the Vai pedal. Bad Horsey is what it's called. That's what I tend to use, and I like the Bad Horsey because when you push on it, it engages, and when you let go, it disengages. You don't have to click it or anything like that to have it come on. It's just when I put my foot on it and start pushing it, it's on. And then when I take my foot off, it's off. Now, I'm not a huge wah user. I like the wah sometimes in solos. I don't do a lot of this thing where you're pumping it the whole time. What I like to do with the wah is I'll push it down. Like when I bend up, I'll push it down at the same time I'm bending up. And I'll just move my foot a little bit relative to the things that I'm doing to create more of a vocal thing with my wah than a rhythm thing. You know, I don't use it a lot for that sort of thing, where some people do, and that's awesome. Mine is more of a vocal element, so I'm trying to use it to make these more, the notes I'm playing a bit more vowel sounding. If I'm playing fast and things like that, I'm not using the wah. It's I let go and it's done. Okay, there are players out there, which I won't name, but there are players out there that you probably are familiar with that use their wah way too much, and again, it winds up being a mask or a veil. It's just wah for the sake of having a wah in there, and then everything is kind of mushy again. So the notes aren't articulated; they're just getting lost behind this wah. So again, for me, the wah is something that I like to use to help accentuate the notes that I'm playing to make them have vowel sounds a bit more. Another thing that works really well is an EQ pedal. Again, none of these are essential. If I was going to name the essential things, I would say reverb and delay are probably the essential ones for a great lead tone. But these are just different things that you can use. An EQ pedal, if I go here, oh, again, you're not going to notice it a lot, but for instance, a Boss GE7 is a really nice EQ pedal. Notice that? I'm going to turn it off. I'm going to turn it on. So what it does is it takes that patch that I've created and it's going to add a little bit more mid-range in there to make it... I never use the smiley face EQ. Okay, that's the death of a guitar player. Mine is actually going to be kind of over the top. It's going to be just the opposite. Okay, my mids are going to be more pronounced. My lows are going to be... they're not really going to alter at all. And then my highs, it kind of depends on what I need. Certainly the ones on the far outside, I'm not going to need those frequencies, but maybe something towards the middle might go up a little bit. So here's without the EQ. Here's with it. So again, I'm cutting through the mix. That's what my EQ is really doing. Some people like to use that EQ on their solos. So they'll just have a regular patch, distortion tone, whatever you've got, and when you want your solo, you hit that EQ pedal, and that's your lead tone. It boosts your signal up a little bit, and you cut through the mix a little bit more, which is a great way of being able to use your EQ. Okay? So now what we'll do is we'll get into a little bit about the amps. Now, right now what I'm using, and we got a photo here to show you, I'm using what's called the 11 rack, which is a guitar system that I'm plugged into. And with all these things that I'm going to talk about here, for the most part, what I do is I create 4 channels or 4 patches. Patch number 1 is a clean tone. With effects, without effects, whatever it is I want, but it's a clean tone. That's channel number 1. Channel number 2 becomes a bit more crunchy. But not much. Okay, just gives me a little more of that kind of tone. Then my third channel is a crunch, kind of a rock and roll AC/DC. And my fourth tone is usually a bit over the edge for more of my metal stuff. And again, the effects will be on or off depending on what it is I'm doing. So that's what I do is I create 4 patches. And then I use the guitar as I've been showing you to adjust from there. Okay, if my volume is all the way up and I'm on this first position of this pickup right here, that's the maximum that patch will give out, except for my little secret here, or like the infinity pedal or whatever it might be that can push it over the edge. That's what I've got. So I can always back off from there by changing a different pickup or lowering my volume or picking softer or whatever it might be. I can adjust backward from there. And I do quite often. Here's another little thing if you don't know this. Another nice thing to do is instead of having your volume on 10 or all the way up all the time when you play, a really nice thing to do is, and I've heard that Slash does this, but if you lower your volume down just a little bit and you learn how to play at that volume all the time, not a lot, just back it off a little bit. Then when you want something more, you can turn it all the way up, and now you've got a maximum flow of signal going through there, and you can push it that way. So that's another neat little trick that you can do. Just instead of always playing on 10 with your volume, back it off and get comfortable with playing back a little bit. Maybe adjust your volume or your patch however needed for there, and when you need it, then you turn it up all the way, and boom, you've got this full-on thing that works. So that's another neat little thing that you can do. So 11 rack is what I'm using right now. Another thing that I use a lot, which I'll show you, this one is a product called Amplitude. And this is a VST or a virtual instrument that you can use in your computer. So instead of having something physical that you're plugging into your computer. And there's a bunch of different ways that we can do that. We're not going to get into that right now. But it's a virtual instrument or a virtual amp inside your computer that you can use. I've got Amplitude that I use a lot. I've got another one called Guitar Rig I use a lot. I've got another one made by Bias that I use a lot. I mean, there's all kinds of them. PV has one called Revolver that's really neat. I've got that one too. So I've got all of these different virtual amps inside my computer, which is nice when I'm recording, because that way if one of my kids comes walking in and I'm recording, you're not going to hear it because I don't have a mic in front of it. The other thing that's nice is, as a result of it being virtual, it's inside my computer, I don't have to run my volumes really hot out here in my house to try and get a decent guitar tone. I can get a decent guitar tone without doing anything. Just I can be on the lowest volume ever and still have that tone. So these virtual instruments that go in your computer are really, really neat if you like to do recording and you don't want to have an amp sitting in your room, or you don't want to have to turn your amp up really loud, all those sorts of things. They're perfect for that sort of thing. The next one I'm going to show you is kind of a multi-effects thing. It's called a Line 6. It's a Pod 500, HD 500, and it's a floorboard. Now, this is a floorboard. I don't own this one, but it's a floorboard that you can use where you don't actually plug into an amp at all. You just plug into the floorboard, and then the floorboard plugs into the PA or your computer or whatever it is you want, and all the effects are built into it. All the amps, there's all kinds of different amp sounds that you can get. They're all built into that one floorboard. Okay? So this is called a multi-effects unit, and there's many different kinds of these. But that's another way that you can go, is instead of having a physical amp with a speaker, you could go into something like this, and then that runs direct into whatever it is that you're doing. And if you're playing on stage, you run then your monitor, your studio monitor that's running towards your face, right? It's on the floor. You can adjust your volume coming out of there, and that's how you would monitor your guitar sounds. So that's another neat thing that you can do. The next one is an actual amp. This one is the Line 6 Spider Valve. This is one that I use a lot when I go on the road and I don't want to bring a big rig. I'll use this. This is a Line 6 amp that has power tubes in it. It's got an actual tube section, a valve section in it. And I like to use this amp. And again, it's got all the bells and whistles built into it. It's got effects and all those things built right into the amp, so I can dial in. And again, I have those 4 channels that I primarily use, just like I'm telling you right now. And then the last one is just an example of a bunch of effects pedals all put together on the floor, which sometimes often is referred to as a floorboard or whatever it would be, but or a pedal rack or whatever you want to call it. And this kind of shows you how you could use a bunch of different pedals all in one thing. So the goal for you is do you want all of this to come from your amp, or do you want them to be out front on the floor as different pedals that you push? Or would you rather have something like that 500, that Line 6 HD 500, where it's all built in and you create them yourself? Or maybe you don't want an amp at all. Maybe you never play outside your room and you'd rather just have it all built into your computer. Then you might use something like a VST or something like that Amplitude that I was talking about. So there's a lot of really neat things that you can do. And I just want you to be aware of that and continue trying to better your tone, better your confidence in what it is that you're doing with your playing, use some of these effects in the ways we've talked about and see if that helps you a little bit. So anyway, take care, stay positive, keep practicing, and let me know how things go. Visit me over at Facebook on the Guitar Zoom community page, and let me know what you've come up with. Let me know some of the pedals that you like the best, or patches that you've made. Maybe you record a video of your playing or an audio of your playing. Let us know what it is that you like to use, and we'll chat about it a little bit. So take care, speak soon, and like I said, stay positive and keep practicing.